Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's presentation. My name is Robert Langley, and today I will be discussing the Oak Ridge Reservation Superfund site in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. This presentation summarizes the site's history, contaminations of concern, potential impacts on human health and the environment, current remediation efforts, and recommendations for future risk management and monitoring. The goal is to provide an overview of the environmental challenges associated with this site and explain how ongoing cleanup efforts are helping reduce risk to both people and ecosystems. Today's presentation will cover several key topics. First, I'll provide a brief history of the Oak Ridge Reservation and explain how contamination occurred. Next, I will discuss the site's current regulatory status and identify the primary contaminants of concern. From there, I will examine potential human health and ecological impacts, including possible synergistic effects associated with multiple contaminants. Finally, I will review current remediation efforts and provide recommendations for future monitoring and risk management activities. Site history. The Oak Ridge Reservation was established during World War II as part of the Manhattan Project, which supported the development of the nation's first nuclear weapons. Three major facilities were constructed on the reservation: the Y-12 National Security Complex, the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and the K-25 Gaseous Diffusion Plant. These facilities conducted uranium processing, weapons research, and other industrial operations for decades. Although these activities played an important role in the nation's defense, they also resulted in releases of hazardous substances into surrounding soils, sediments, groundwater, and surface waters. Over time, these releases created contamination concerns that eventually required extensive investigation and remediation efforts under federal environmental programs. Current site status. Today, the Oak Ridge Reservation remains an active federal facility under the management of the Department of Energy. Cleanup activities are conducted under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, commonly known as CERSLA, with oversight from the Environmental Protection Agency and the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. Significant progress has been made over the last several decades. However, contamination remains in certain areas, particularly within groundwater systems, stream sediments, and floodplain soils. Because of these remaining concerns, long-term monitoring and remediation continues throughout the reservation. Contaminants of concern. Several contaminants have been identified as primary concerns at Oak Ridge. These include mercury, polychlorinated biofluorines or PCBs, uranium, trichloroethylene, known as TCE, and other volatile organic compounds and heavy metals. Each contaminant behaves differently within the environment. Some migrate through groundwater while others accumulate in sediments and biological tissue. Understanding how these contaminants move through environmental systems is crucial for evaluating both ecological and human health risks. The remainder of the presentation will focus on how these contaminants affect environmental quality and public health. Mercury. Mercury is one of the most significant contaminants associated with Oak Ridge Reservation, particularly within the East Fork Poplar Creek. Historical industrial operations at the Y-12 facility release large quantities of mercury into the environment. Once mercury enters aquatic systems, certain microorganisms can convert it into methylmercury, a more toxic form that is readily absorbed by living organisms. Methylmercury accumulates within fish tissues and increases in concentration as it moves through the food chain. This process, known as biomagnification, creates elevated exposure risk for fish, wildlife, and humans who consume contaminated fish. PCBs. Polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, are another major contaminant found throughout portions of the Oak Ridge Reservation. PCBs were historically used in electrical equipment and industrial applications because of their chemical stability. Unfortunately, that same stability makes them highly persistent in the environment. PCBs tend to bind strongly to sediments and organic material. As a result, they can remain within aquatic systems for decades and continue to enter food webs long after their original release. Potential health concerns include cancer risk, endocrine disruption, immune system effects, and reproductive impacts on both humans and wildlife. Uranium and heavy metals. In addition to mercury and PCBs, uranium and other heavy metals remain contaminants of concern at several locations throughout the reservation. These substances entered the environment through decades of nuclear material processing and industrial activities. Heavy metals can accumulate within soils and sediments, while uranium may migrate through groundwater under certain environmental conditions. Long-term exposure can affect both ecological receptors and human populations. Potential health effects include kidney damage, developmental impacts, and ecological toxicity. Because these contaminants can persist for long periods, continued monitoring remains essential. Trichloroethylene, or TCE. Trichloroethylene, commonly called TCE, is a chlorinated solvent that was widely used for industrial cleaning and degreasing operations at the Oak Ridge, Tennessee site. At Oak Ridge, historical use of TCEs resulted in groundwater contamination at several locations. One of the challenges associated with TCE is its ability to migrate through groundwater and eventually enter buildings through a process known as vapor intrusion. During vapor intrusion, contaminated groundwater releases vapors that move into indoor air spaces. Potential health concerns for TCE include kidney cancer, liver toxicity, immune system effects, and neurological impacts following long-term exposure. Fate and transport. Understanding how contaminants move through the environment is an important part of environmental toxicology and risk assessment. Contaminants released at Oak Ridge can travel through multiple environmental media, including soil, groundwater, surface water, sediments, and air. Some contaminants remain near their original source areas, while others migrate significant distances through groundwater systems or stream networks. Once contaminants have entered biological systems, they may accumulate within plants and animals and move through food webs. Evaluating these pathways helps scientists identify exposure risks and develop effective remediation strategies. Human exposure pathways. To understand human health risk, it is important to understand how people may come into contact with contaminants. At Oak Ridge, the primary exposure pathway includes ingestion, inhalation, and dermal contact. People may be exposed through contaminated groundwater, surface water, sediments, fish consumption, or potentially through contaminated indoor air where vapor intrusion occurs. Certain populations are more vulnerable than others. Children, pregnant women, older adults, and individuals with pre-existing health conditions are often more sensitive to environmental contaminants. Understanding who may be exposed and how exposure occurs is one of the most important parts of the risk assessment process because it helps determine where management efforts should be focused. Human health impacts. The contaminants present at Oak Ridge can affect human health in different ways, depending on the substance, dose, duration of exposure, and individual susceptibility. Mercury is primarily associated with neurological and developmental effects, particularly in children and developing fetuses. PCBs have been linked to cancer, endocrine disruption, reproductive effects, and immune system impairment. Uranium can affect kidney function, while TCE's exposure has been associated with liver toxicity, kidney cancer, and neurological effects. While current remediation efforts have significantly reduced many exposure risks, understanding these potential health impacts remain essential for long-term monitoring and protection of nearby communities. Synergistic human health effects. One challenge in environmental toxicology is that people are rarely exposed to a single contaminant in isolation. At Oak Ridge, multiple contaminants may be present within the same environmental media, creating the potential for additive or synergistic effects. Synergistic effects occurs when the combined impact of two or more contaminants is greater than the effect of each contaminant individually. Although these interactions are often difficult to quantify precisely, they represent an important source of uncertainty in risk assessment. Evaluating combined exposures helps provide a more realistic understanding of environmental health risks and support more protective management decisions. Ecological receptors. The Oak Ridge Reservation contains a wide variety of ecosystems that support numerous plant and animal species. Ecological receptors of concern include fish, aquatic invertebrates, amphibians, birds, mammals, and other organisms that depend on local habitats. East Fork, Popular Creek, and surrounding wetlands are particularly important because contaminants entering these aquatic systems can affect multiple trophic levels simultaneously. Species exposed to contaminants may experience changes in growth, reproduction behavior, and survival. These impacts can eventually influence population health and ecosystem stability if contamination remains present for extended periods. Ecological impacts. Ecological impacts occur when contaminants interfere with normal biological processes with individual organisms or ecosystems. Mercury provides one of the clearest examples at Oak Ridge. Once converted into methylmercury, it accumulates within aquatic organisms and increases in concentration as predators consume contaminated prey. This process can expose top predators to levels much higher than those found in the surrounding environment. PCBs and other persistent contaminants can produce similar effects through bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Potential ecological impacts include reduced reproductive success, developmental abnormalities, behavioral changes, and alterations in community structure. These effects highlight the importance of considering long-term ecological health when evaluating contaminated sites. Ecological Risk Assessment Model. This conceptual model illustrates how contaminants move through their sources through environmental media and ultimately affect ecological receptors. The process begins with contaminated sources such as industrial release or contaminated soils. Contaminants then move through environmental pathways including groundwater, surface water, sediments, and biological systems. Organisms become exposed through ingestion, direct contact, or uptake from their environment. These exposures may lead to adverse ecological effects, ranging from individual health impacts to broader ecosystem level consequences. Conceptual models like this are valuable because they simplify complex environmental systems and help identify critical areas for monitoring and remediation. Existing remediation efforts. Significant remediation efforts have been conducted throughout the Oak Ridge Reservation over the last several decades. Cleanup activities have included contaminated soil removal, sediment excavation, groundwater treatment systems, contaminant structures, and habitat restoration projects. Extensive environmental monitoring programs have also been established to track contaminant concentrations and evaluate remedial effectiveness. These efforts have reduced contaminant levels in many areas and lowered exposure risks to both humans and wildlife. However, some contamination remains, particularly within groundwater systems and historical source areas. As a result, long-term management and monitoring continue to play an important role in site stewardship. Risk management recommendations. Based on the available information, several recommendations can help support continued protection of public health and environmental quality. First, long-term groundwater monitoring should remain a priority to identify any changes in contamination migration patterns. Second, fish tissue monitoring should continue to track mercury and PCB concentrations within aquatic food webs. Third, community outreach programs should remain active to ensure that residents understand current risks and protective measures. Additional recommendations include continued source control efforts, adaptive management strategies, and expanded ecological monitoring programs. Together, these actions can help maintain progress while addressing remaining contamination concerns. Future monitoring strategies. Monitoring is essential because environmental conditions change over time. Future monitoring efforts should focus on contaminants of concern, including mercury, PCBs, uranium, and TCE. Monitoring programs should evaluate groundwater quality, surface water conditions, sediment contamination, fish tissue concentrations, and ecological recovery indicators. Data collected through these programs can help identify emerging concerns before they become larger problems. Monitoring also provides valuable information for evaluating remediation, effectiveness, and support future management decisions. Continued collaboration among federal, state, and local agencies will be critical for maintaining an effective long-term monitoring strategy. In conclusion, the Oak Ridge Reservation represents one of the most complex environmental remediation projects in the United States. Historical, industrial, and nuclear activities resulted in contamination by mercury, PCBs, uranium, TCE, and other hazardous substances. These contaminants have affected soils, sediments, groundwater, surface waters, wildlife, and potentially human populations throughout multiple exposure pathways. Although substantial cleanup progress has been achieved, long-term monitoring and management remain necessary. Continued cooperation among the Department of Energy, Environmental Protection Agency, Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, and local stakeholders will be essential for protecting both environmental and public health. Ultimately, effective risk assessment, remediation, and monitoring provide the foundation for restoring ecosystem and reducing future risks. The information presented today was developed using sources from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, Department of Energy, environmental reports, peer-reviewed scientific literature, and other credible environmental management resources. These references provide information regarding the site, the history, contamination, behavior, human health impacts, ecological risk assessment, remediation activities, and long-term monitoring efforts. Thank you for your time and attention. I appreciate the opportunity to present this assessment of the Oak Ridge Reservation Superfund site, and I will be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.